Hello, my name is James Robson, and I'm the Victor and William Fung Director of the Harvard Asia Center. And I wanted to welcome everybody to this afternoon's discussion of the recent coup in Myanmar and its aftermath. And I wanted to thank our panelists today for taking time to join us, given how busy and they are trying to keep track of everything that's going on and monitoring and keeping the news coming out of Myanmar. So thank you again for joining us. So today we're joined by four panelists, and I'll just introduce them very briefly before we begin the discussion. The first is Weiwei Nu, who is a former political prisoner and the founder and executive director of the Women's Peace Network in Burma. She spent 7 years as a political prisoner, and most recently she was a genocide prevention fellow at the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. Second, we have the Honorable Tom Andrews, who is the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Myanmar. He's a former member of Congress from Maine, and he's also Robina Senior Human Rights Fellow at Yale University Law School and an associate of the Harvard Asia Center. Third, we have Mathew Smith, who is the co-founder and chief executive officer of Fortify Rights, a human rights organization that's based in Southeast Asia that supports human rights defenders and investigates human rights violations. He's also a Carr Center Fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard University. And finally, we have Tyler Giannini, who is a clinical professor of law and the co-director of the Harvard Law School's Human Rights Program and its International Human Rights Clinic, and has extensive experience working in Myanmar. So thank you all for joining us. And what I thought it would be useful is, since we, on November 18th, the Harvard Asia Center hosted a panel discussion with many of you discussing the elections that happened in Myanmar. And here we are, just over 2 months removed from that initial discussion, and we're faced with a situation of a coup that's now happened in Myanmar, and also the growing protests on the streets that we've seen in recent days as well. So I would like to hear from each of you, if possible, to reflect a little bit on how we got from the elections to where we are now and what's happened just a little over a week ago. So shall we begin with Weiwei and do it in the order that I introduce people, if that's okay?
Thank you for having me here, and I'm very honored to be with the same panel with many of all of you, who I am inspired so much and admired so much. So yes, we had a discussion 2 months ago, and many of us in Myanmar, and many of us who are working on the human rights field or are not expecting in these situations. We knew there were tensions between NLD leadership and the military leader, Min Aung Hlaing, Commander-in-Chief Min Aung Hlaing. There has been tensions between them for a long time, but yet we were not expecting something this level could happen. Firstly, because the system that we have right now, we had under the 2008 Constitution itself already shared power between the civilian government and the military. As we know, the military is holding 3 major ministries under the Constitution, as well as 25% of the parliamentary seat. So given that political systems and the allocations of power between the civilian and the military, we thought, this is something that they should satisfy beyond the expectation, and also we have the record of gross international human rights violations in Rakhine State and many other ethnic areas, and we have this ongoing investigations and lawsuit at the International Court of Justice and in International Criminal Court, and in Argentina, all of these things, somehow, given this all of these situations, we somehow think the military wouldn't do, what they did now or last week, and but there are many other considerations among the other considerations and other factors that people are talking about as well. I think the panelists would be able to articulate that further. The military, the commander-in-chief is going to be supposed to be retired in June. So there is discussions between among the military leadership for a new commander-in-chief position. So he is kind of really worried of losing his power. And it is also very important to him to stay in power so that he can protect the businesses that he controls, he and his family and his extended family members control in the country. So, there is a political interest as well as economic interest, and the clashes between the egos of two leaders from the civilian side and military side. And all of these things led to a disastrous situations right now. But this is something that very, very dangerous for the country. And it is, again, a nightmare for the country. And I think we are in a very, very difficult situation.
Thank you, Wei Wei. And we'll get back in just a little bit to reflect a little bit on some of the things that are going on the ground right now. But we'll shift now to, how about to Tom?
Thank you, James. And it's good to see everybody. I'm afraid we have to see each other under these circumstances. And obviously, as Wei Wei put it quite well, it is a nightmare. It is a remarkable set of circumstances and developments. And to answer your question, James, I did not predict this for precisely the reasons that Wei Wei has just described. I mean, remember this Constitution was written by the generals. It was written specifically to give them enormous power, enormous impunity, insulated them from any kind of accountability. As Wei Wei said, 3 major ministries, 25% of the seats in the parliament, enormous wealth, access to and control of these economic institutions that just provided them with enormous wealth. So they were essentially lacked accountability and became very insular. And one of the patterns I've noticed of them in over the years is that they are very insular. They convince themselves that they are whoever they are. They're the beloved leaders of the people, etc. So maybe these results that they saw were just so shocking to them, as we saw in elections past. They just couldn't believe that people would not be supporting their political party, the political party associated with the Tatmadaw. So there must be something wrong. Well, obviously, if there is something wrong, if you have concerns or questions or problems with the way things are run, you don't overthrow an entire government. You don't commit a coup d'etat. This is just absolutely outrageous and unacceptable. And I agree with Wei Wei. It's a nightmare, and it's very, very dangerous because they are so insular. And we know what they have done in the past. Under similar circumstances. We know the brutality with which they've responded to mounting pressure. I'm just in awe of the people of Myanmar on the streets, watching them with security personnel all around them. These edicts that say any crowds larger than 5 are illegal. But nonetheless, there they are on the streets, civil servants, healthcare workers, teachers, bankers, so many people of civil society joining a general strike despite all the pressure. And for those of us who are close to us, who we work with, that have been on the front lines of democracy and human rights in Myanmar, they're in a particularly precarious situation. Many of them are in hiding. And it's not just the knock on the door, in the middle of the night, although that's, of course, a source of great fear and is happening, but it's the thugs on the street. And we've seen groups shifted on trucks to different parts of the country to literally go and beat people up. So it's the formal mechanisms, the arrests, and that we've seen. It's the presence of security forces, and then we've seen all these other techniques like the use of thugs. So it's very, very dangerous. It's incredibly important that we pay very, very close attention to what's going on, and that the generals know that we are watching them very, very closely, and that we're committed to doing everything possible in partnership with those on the ground in Myanmar to support them in this great hour of need.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tom. It would also be interesting, perhaps a little bit later, to reflect a little bit on what you think the role the UN might be able to play on this, and actually think a little bit perhaps about the position of our own new government, which I remember when we had the panel in November, we were tracking how actually absurd it was how the two places we were having similar issues about issues of voting and fraud and claims of fraud and perhaps an attempted coup and all of this stuff. This is, but I'd be curious if you knew anything as well, just in terms of what the Biden administration is doing in this regard, or the position that they hold vis-a-vis Myanmar right now as well. But let's shift to Matt now, please.
Thanks so much, James. And thanks for convening this under these unfortunate circumstances. I can only echo what Weiwei and Tom shared with regard to how, Myanmar got to this point. And it is in some ways, it was an awkward overthrow because the military essentially overthrew the political system that itself created, as the Special Rapporteur noted. And of course, right now, the situation is of urgency with regard to the human rights situation on the ground. At Fortify Rights, we've been working with human rights defenders to document day to day what's been going on. I'm very happy to talk more about that. But again, just, in terms of how we got here, obviously the military has retained tremendous political power. It also has tremendous economic power. But even so, even with the threats of a coup, we of course were expressing our concern about that as it was happening. But regardless, when this coup actually unfolded on those early morning hours of February 1st, it did still come as a shock. It came as a shock that they would go so far as to arrest government scores of members of parliament, State Councilor Aung San Suu Kyi, President Win Myint, and others. And so right now, again, there are severe human rights violations taking place, and I'm happy to share with you all about what we know about that.
Great, definitely. I'd like to come back to that and perhaps hear everyone as well. Just share any information that you might know about that's been happening on the ground, because it's difficult, obviously, for many people to get good information coming out of Myanmar right now. So this would be a good opportunity to share some of that. But first, we'll turn to Tyler for his comments.
So thanks, James. It's really great to be here and be able to talk about the important things. I wish the circumstances were different, but it's really important that the Asia Center is convening this, and I'm happy to be highlighting some of the things that are really important to get out there. Maybe to supplement maybe a couple of things that Matt and Tom and Weiwei have said, which is, yes, I think the surprise is there of the timing because there's so much power that's residual within the military and the structure. At the same time, I think some of the warning signs were there. Now, of course, it's shock when it happens. And because of the structural problems that were there, this is not a full-fledged democracy, right? We know that. What does a full-fledged democracy looks like? It's more than the election. It is very much about rights protection. Well, the situation with the crisis of the Rohingya and the international crimes that they've experienced, that highlights that rights protection had not taken place in the country. What is democracy about? It's about power sharing. That also was not really there. And it's also about accountabilities. And so these key markers of what a real democracy looks like were not there. Now it's brazen to do what they're doing and to take over like this. But really the only thing that you see of the key markers is the voting piece, these other institutional pieces and the fragility of emerging democracy, we're not there yet. And so why now? I think it is what Wei talked about, the economic holdings of the military and the commander-in-chief. That's one piece. I think one other piece I'd be interested to see if other people think this is maybe there's some concern about the international accountability mechanisms that are in play, and that the commander-in-chief doesn't want to relinquish full power because he's concerned about not controlling the way that the Myanmar state is engaging with these international accountability mechanisms. So it's extremely terrifying to see the reports coming out of on the ground. But we know from decades and decades what this military does, and that they never really relinquish full power in this effort to call it democracy.
Yeah, so this is, something, I mean, my understanding is that, so when the military initiated the coup, that they declared a state of emergency that was, I guess, is scheduled to last for 1 year. But it's unclear to me what their sort of game plan is, or what's going to, in terms of just managing the country and doing all of this, what's going to be happening over the next months, and what are their aims? I mean, besides, clearly there's this economic and political motivations behind that, and Tyler mentioned possibly even some vis-a-vis international cases that are causing some pressure behind here as well. But I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts as well, or you could respond to each other, but also just thinking about what is the situation on the ground right now, just in terms of the military's plan, but also what kinds of things are happening day to day right now as well, in terms of resistance to that, or formally or informally, just in terms of protests happening in the streets as well, but perhaps other mechanisms that I might not be aware of that are also happening. So
I can just weigh in quickly in response to Tyler's point. I think well, we've been speaking with people in the country who well-placed individuals who are sharing information with us that indicates at least some members of the Myanmar military genuinely believe there was widespread voter fraud. This obviously does not justify what they're doing. It doesn't justify arbitrarily arresting the head of state or other members of parliament or human rights defenders. It doesn't justify excessive force. It doesn't justify any of that. I think there are a lot of different components to what motivates the Myanmar military. I think the economic interests, as Wei mentioned, are a big component to it. The fact that the military, members of the military, could potentially they're being investigated for international crimes, as Tyler pointed out. I think that's part of it, and I think the election part is also involved.
If I may add on the election part, so yes, military has presented the numbers like 10 million people or 10 million voter fraud. However, any of this has been presented in a way with credible evidences and proof. So it seems to me and many of us, it's an excuse or a justification to give for the coup. And even so, I think the coup itself is unlawful, illegal, even under the Constitution. They were referring to the constitutional section 417, which actually required the president to agree on the coup, or on the declaring state of emergency. But now they actually arrest the president and the head of the state. So this act already is illegal, and that has to be condemned and rejected. So that is, I think, very important. And they're doing everything they can. They're taking all the attempt to normalize the coup and to legitimize. So they are reaching out to ethnic community leaders and religious leaders to basically legitimize the state of emergency, declarations of state of emergency, and the coup itself. And that is one factor. On the other hand, we also feel like, as human rights activists, many in the ground, we're talking about like the impunity that the military has been enjoying for several decades. So we had this political transformations in 2010, 11, under this 2008 constitution. But during this transition period, we never discussed or addressed the crimes that they have committed in the past. So there wasn't any transitional justice processes, and there wasn't any discussions around accountability that on the military's conduct against the ethnic communities and against the students, the killing and the arrests, mass killing, widespread killing and arrests, and the human rights violation that they have committed in the past. And that somehow, kind of signal them to continue commit human rights violations. And that's led to crimes of genocides and crimes against humanity against the Rohingya populations and war crimes against other communities, right? And even so, yes, we have international justice processes ongoing. However, these processes are slow, and these processes were not led by the states or the countries, the international communities. It was most of them were initiated by for example, on the case of International Court of Justice, it was initiated by the small state of Gambia, right? And then in ICC, it was their own initiative. And in Argentina, UG case, it was initiated by the human rights organization. It was not actual pressure from the international community or the government. And that's, again, empower them to take another step for this level. I think that is one component that we have to consider here, lack of accountability and the impunity that they have been enjoying for all of the past human rights violations and international crimes that they have committed.
I think Weiwei is exactly right, and that the regime wants to normalize, quote unquote, normalize things just as quickly as possible. And there was the address by the commander-in-chief to the public, and they want to move on with their 5-point plan. The ministries are now being run by technocrats, bureaucrats, those civil society people that were in those ministries, elevated to positions. My understanding is that there's a real concern that those ministries be able to function well and competently, and they want to see business as usual. We're open for business, is what they're declaring to the international community. We want friendly relations, as the commander-in-chief said, which puts a tremendous responsibility on all of us. To answer your question about the international community and the Biden administration, for that matter, I was very pleased to see a very quick statement from the Biden administration expressing outrage at what was going on, and then mentioning, right out of the gate, sanctions and the need for targeted sanctions. And that was extremely important, because in all of my conversations with governments, media, etc., many of those questions and discussions were all framed not about whether there will be sanctions, but what kind of sanctions. How could we have targeted sanctions that won't hurt the public? How can we coordinate those sanctions, not just one country, but many countries? So that's the discussion that's going on right now. And the idea is to, hit them where it hurts, their wallet, and get as many countries to coordinate with this as humanly possible. The United Nations Security Council, as you know, met last week. It was a good sign that they met. I know that there was a lot of discussion about whether they would release a statement at all, and we all know the big challenge there. It's called China. And but despite those obstacles, the statement that they put out was actually, in my view, pretty remarkable. They demanded the immediate release of everyone who had been detained. They immediately demanded full respect for human rights. They said that the government needs to uphold democratic institutions. So this was language that was very, very welcome. This week, the Human Rights Council will meet. I'll be making a presentation to them on Friday. And there's a real interest in having the community the international community to be able to coordinate, to come together as one. And I think with diplomatic and political pressure complemented with very focused, tough economic pressure, that is going to be the key. But it has to be, and I'll just end with this. In my conversations, I know that there are many in government that are saying, look, we need to work together to do this, which I think is exactly right, particularly from the United States. The idea of the United States working in collaboration with others is very, very good. But I think we need speed as well. And I've been urging various governments, yes, let's try to coordinate to the extent possible, but let's not sacrifice our capacity to respond quickly, swiftly, and directly to this crisis with sanctions and obviously with an international arms embargo, just as quickly as we can.
I think I would put on the table one additional piece of this, which is the domestic power that's playing out of the people. So we talked about voting, right? The vote, I think one of the things that is probably in the military's mind, and I agree completely with Matt that you can't really know, is that the power of the NLD, which is really representing the voting power of the majority population, is enormous. And so that just sends a signal that power there is there. And what are we seeing now with the civil disobedience? Vibrant civil society, the strength and courage. It is pure courage to be out in the streets, knowing what this military's history is of the people. And so part of the response is international, but I think it's also about how does international support, protect, and encourage that people power to come forth and stay there, because eventually that's the root of democratic institutions. And I think the people on the street just really shows this is a black and white issue for them. They do not want military rule. They want civilian rule.
Yeah, all the more shocking then to come, so closely after democratically held elections insofar as they were. I mean, I remember the one of the big topics of our conversation before was disenfranchisement of Rohingya and others, Shan State and others that we talked about last time. But I think people kind of said, okay, well, in the end, still it was better than it could have been at that time. And so this, is really, comes as even more of a shock to then really go straight at those people who were the ones who participated in that election. But I wonder if we could, I would love to also have a chance to hear just update what's going on as people get information up to today, even as well, just to hear a little bit of how the situation is evolving. Some of these other political, international, and domestic ones will probably play out over time, but just to give a little better sense of what's going on the ground, as far as if anybody would like to share any of that information, I think it would be really valuable.
I'm happy to chime in
Matt?
there. Yeah, I'm happy to chime in. So we know, of course, that the military has arrested or detained more than 170 people. That's according to our friends at the Assistance Association for Political Prisoners. Beyond that, the government has issued. They're attempting to cut access to internet. They banned Facebook, so they recognize the power in the people. And they're trying to tamp that down. Today was the largest protests yet. There were protests in more than 300 towns and cities throughout the country. We know that the authorities are using water cannons, high-pressure water cannons against peaceful protesters, causing some injuries. We know that in Naypyidaw at protests today, the police shot and killed a 19-year-old student, a young woman, that kind, 19 years old, shot in the head. We managed to confirm with doctors in Naypyidaw that it was live ammunition. It was not rubber bullets. We've also seen rubber bullets, but in this particular case, she was shot and killed with live ammunition. Another young man was shot in the chest. I believe he survived his injuries or will survive his injuries. And there are scores of others who were injured throughout the country. We're seeing scenes that are scarily reminiscent of 1988 and 2007, both situations of street protests, of the people rising up for democracy and human rights. And in both of those situations ended in the authorities opening fire on unarmed protesters. And in both of those cases, we saw things get progressively more violent over a period of time. And I think, the military and the police are both, there have been a lot of positive changes in Myanmar over the years. Obviously, a lot of very serious problems as well, genocide, war crimes, but the military and the police are unreformed institutions. And when we're seeing these scenes of police officers in Mandalay, for example, we see scenes of police officers pulling up in trucks, barreling out of the trucks and opening fire, either in the air or in some cases at street level. These terrifying scenes that the people of Myanmar are very bravely dealing with. It is reminiscent of these past situations. Our fear right now is that the military will continue to use excessive force. We fear that they will open fire on unarmed protesters. We fear the worst. And the people of Myanmar are giving no indication that they will stand down. Their positions are clear about what needs to happen. This coup needs to be reversed. And, this is a military, again, just to reiterate, this is a military that's led by people who are responsible for genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and other human rights violations. They've been enjoying impunity for years. And so this is the urgency of the situation from our perspective.
Yeah, just to add to what Matt has said already. So tomorrow there will be even bigger general strikes throughout the country, and we are very, very worried for the military responses. And we're seeing right now, as Matt said, it's the same pattern. So they will not take actions immediately. They will let them do, a couple of days or weeks, and then they crack down in every time whenever we had the protests or, in the case of 1988, like revolutions as movement. In 1988 and in 2007, it was the same pattern. And now we are really, worried about the situations. And I think that is why we need immediate international response to the situations. And that includes the calling for the safety and security of the protesters, peaceful protesters, and the asking military not to excessively use or crack down the people. It's very, very critical, and people are not going to step down, obviously, and civil disobedience movements are ongoing, and the significant or the astonishing part of this movement is that it's not unlike previous time. It's like people movement, like people, average people coming out, and the activists and younger activists, we're talking about Generation Z, and the student activists, farmers, workers are coming out even before NLD or the other political leaders give a signal to them. So they came out to call to reject the military coup, and it's been led by the young people. And right now they started to coordinate between across the groups for the calls and message in terms of on the protests. And the general message is rejecting the military coup, and the call for the release of Aung San Suu Kyi and President Win Myint and all detainees. And then there are some longer term the calls on the political crisis that we have now. Those are abolishing 2008 constitution and establishing truly democratic federal union. And I think these are some of the calls coming from mostly a more liberal and progressive younger generation activists and civil society groups, as well as from many ethnic communities, like leaders mean younger one. So I think the message has somehow started to disseminate across the country, the similar message. However, we need to understand that many people who are taking, going out and taking involving in this protests are actually, yes, there are many of them are military, perhaps the NLD members and supported. However, a lot of them are simply, united or getting together to reject the military coup, regardless of they support the Aung San Suu Kyi and its government or not, and also, they are taking a chance to basically to show their rejections to the military on the contacts that they have on the military's conducts and attitudes towards the people by saying we don't accept these constitutions and we want a true democracy, we want a federal union. So they're simply rejecting the status quo as well as rejecting the military coup.
Well, I guess if there's any common ground between the people that are on the street that are working very, very hard for their democracy and some of those that are in power, it's let's get rid of this constitution for completely opposite reasons. I think, we all, maybe in our last conversation, we were talking about the state of democracy in Myanmar. It was obviously a fragile but growing, developing democracy. It was not a democracy per se. And of course, we were very concerned and critical about the fact that an entire population of people were not able to vote in that election because of their identity, who they are, and their race, their ethnicity, and the God who they pray to. This is obviously not a democracy in the way that we all believe in a democracy. And in fact, someone actually asked me in the media, they said, so wait a minute, weren't you criticizing this election before it happened? And I mean, this is the same election that you were critical of that now you're saying should not have been overturned. Well, obviously our criticisms, my criticism, were vastly different from the criticisms and objections of the military. But what is so incredible to me, and I've been talking every day to people on the streets, is just the absolute 100% commitment that they show, despite the odds, despite the fear, despite the intimidation, to fight this, to fight for their country, to fight for their future, to fight for their children. Many have framed it in this way, for our future. We've seen what this can do. We've lived through a brutal military regime. We're not going back there, and we're not going to tolerate our children being subjected to this kind of a life. So we as an international community really need to step up, and we need to be worthy of the courage and tenacity of the people on the streets in Myanmar. And I'll tell you, the stakes are very, very high. But this is the time for us, notwithstanding the news cycle that you mentioned, James, to be relentlessly pursuing, our governments, our regional institutions, our economic institutions, to exert all the pressure necessary to overturn this travesty.
I think the only thing that I might add is that we're talking about mostly the visible resistance and the visible things that we see, but we know that needs to be maintained, because what is the the suppression of the vote that you were talking about several weeks ago, or in November, in the aftermath of the election, that's about invisibility. And this has really heightened the focus on the NLD and the major cities. But as Matt said, it's happening all over the country. So the places where it's less visible, and we know in ethnic nationality areas, that's often where you have constant abuses, not just 1988, not just 2007, but persistent abuse. And so the concern as well has to be that if the visibility goes down, you're not only going to have it in the cities, but you're going to have that renewal of the oppression that ethnic nationalities have had for decades because of the military coming into their areas and committing violent abuses. So that's the other piece of this I think is worth naming, is the visibility has got to be maintained.
Well, that's actually one of the major goals of doing this, to be quite honest, is to provide some visibility, to have a platform to share recent information, and to try to keep a spotlight on these issues that are happening under our very noses right now, happening, and watching what happens tomorrow. Very important to keep an eye on all of this. And I think, Tyler's point of sort of bringing up keeping an eye on the domestic activities that are going on, as we balance that with us being outside, and many of you playing very essential roles for marshaling international organizations to not just have that visibility, but to also act upon things that are happening, and to try to assert pressure wherever it can be put is really essential. And I applaud you all for the work that you keep doing. I know that you probably had very long nights and over the last week trying to keep up the vigilance and attention to this. And I just hope that this is a very real situation given the precedent, but let's hope that just as much as people were surprised by the coup happening last week, that we'll be equally surprised that perhaps cooler heads will prevail, and there might be some way to de-escalate what's happening, and perhaps work towards a solution that'll get back towards some of the principles I think that came out of our earlier discussion, which were hopefulness for democracy in light of a real situation where there were still problems. But I think at least I came away from that discussion feeling as if there was still some hope there, even though there still were major issues that needed to be dealt with even in the aftermath of the elections. But this is clearly a complete left turn away from all of that, and it has real implications. So once again, thank you all for sharing this information. Thank you all for the work that you're doing ongoing. We'll try to spread as much information as we can get out there with your voice and what you've all been able to say. And let's all hope as we go through this that the de-escalation will happen, and the right decisions will be made for the people of Myanmar. So thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you, James. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. So nice to meet you all again.